Welcome to part 2 on chapter 3 on globalization. So just to finish up this anti-globalization piece, so these major organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, although they've done a lot of terrific things in the world and tried to improve the lives of the folks and across all sorts of different continents, there is a large group of people that have criticized them because you think about all the money, for example, that's been spent on development projects, loans, that type of thing, that a lot of countries maybe that that were extremely poor 40 or 50 years ago are still extremely poor today. Despite the efforts of some of these major international institutions, we still have some of the same, poverty issues, inequality issues, and all those type of problems going on. So a lot of folks have called for a fundamental rethinking of how we go about doing these type of things in the international community. So moving on, your book just glances over these two terms. Well, for our video here, I want to go into them a little bit more in depth. So we have these two terms of offshoring and outsourcing. And we'll get to the specific definitions in the next slide here. But just quickly here, one of the things we want to look at with respect to globalization is labor mobility, right? So think about the idea of people being able to travel internationally or even within a country, perhaps to take advantage of new economic opportunities. So with a lot of things, again, just any economic system, there might be people that gain, right, winners in the system, and then people that lose in the system. So your book makes the argument that gender also plays a key role, and also race comes into play there as well. So there's the argument that women of color tend to lose low-paying jobs in the developed world, right? Say like the United States, Western Europe, Australia, places like that, where then the same women of color in developing countries, right, places that are still overwhelmingly poor, are actually gaining from those new jobs. So again, it kind of depends on maybe where you live. Again, whether you're experiencing a gain or loss is obviously going to color how you sort of, or going to affect how you think about globalization, right? If you have a new job and you have benefited tremendously because of that new job, then you're going to be a huge fan of globalization. If you feel that somebody has taken your job, you become out of work, but perhaps because of the same factor, then obviously you're going to have more of a negative viewpoint toward it. So again, these two terms, offshoring and outsourcing, are sometimes used interchangeably, but they're actually very different things. So I wanted to spend a minute on those. So offshoring, again, you think about, obviously has a different shore there, so we're thinking about more of an international thing. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to cross an ocean. So say, for example, United States could offshore something to Mexico or Canada, even though we share a land border. It doesn't necessarily have to do anything with the ocean. So this is the idea of relocation by a company of a business process from one country to another, reduce labor costs. So one thing that often comes to mind when people think about offshoring would be something like a call center, right? A help desk. So say, for example, you have a Visa credit card and you're going to call that 800 number to try to get some help about your account. If somebody answers the phone in Mumbai, India, or something like that, that would be an example of offshoring, right? Where, say, Visa or Citibank or whoever has relocated that process from one country to another, right? Now, say, oftentimes these go together, where that could also be considered an instance of outsourcing, where this is the contracting out of an internal business process to a third party. So this would be something more like an example I use sometimes is that what we're using here in our class, right? So an internal business process that we use at the college is Blackboard. So instead of our college creating its own sort of content management thing, where I say, go on to this website that our school has created and look at the files and all that, we have outsourced that to Blackboard, right? A third-party organization. So they handle all that kind of stuff themselves. So instead of us doing it in-house, somebody else does it, right? And then just to finish that part up, so you can see here, outsourcing involves some external company, right? So, like I said, it has to be a different entity, where offshoring is often the same thing. So that call center example, maybe those people would still be Visa employees or something like that. So just a little different ways of looking at it. So I thought you might find this part funny here. So again, thinking about an instance of outsourcing. So this guy, he's either a genius or an idiot, depending on how you want to look at it. But you can see this one. It says, man outsources his own job to China, watches cat videos. So this guy, again, a six-figure software developer. So he kind of had the idea like, hey, somebody in China could do my job for a whole lot less. So basically all he did was get paid, by his company, and then pay somebody in China to basically do his job for him, while all he did was sit around and play on Facebook and play computer games all day at his desk. I think once the company found out about it, he wasn't there too much longer. Um, but again, just kind of gives you an idea of the outsourcing idea. So moving along here. So speaking about outsourcing, you might remember from the 2012 presidential election, Mitt Romney, for a big part of his career, worked with this group called Bain Capital. So what they did, where they were a big sort of financial organization that came in and sort of helped struggling companies, or tried to reorganize companies that were maybe having some issues. So one they used often as an example during the campaign was the Staples store, the kind of office supplies, all that sort of stuff. So this is a website sort of criticizing, his record on outsourcing American jobs. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a partisan attack here. So remember, the idea about globalization, it depends on how you look at it. So, Mitt Romney and his group would maybe say, well, yeah, maybe some American jobs had to go overseas, but at least Staples is still operating. That they say, well, that was just a process of, or that was a result of globalization. That they say, well, if that's just something that we had to do. If we hadn't stepped in, then all the Staples stores would be closed, and then thousands and thousands of Americans would be out of work. So I said, yeah, you might lose a little bit through outsourcing and offshoring these jobs, but if it still gain, a lot of people in the United States gain from it, then it's a good thing, right? So again, if you're a Mitt Romney fan, you're going to think what he did with his financial services company was a good thing. If you were opposed to him, obviously you would view it much more negatively. So that your book also mentioned, this is a little bit more abstract. A couple professors at Duke wrote this book Empire a few years ago, and actually they've come out with two more and created into a trilogy. Empire is the first one, and the second book is called Multitude, and then the third one is called Commonwealth. So I'd encourage you to Google those three if you're interested in what those guys were all about. So they're just sort of thinking about different ways of how we organize the international community, right? So nowadays we sort of have this idea of, I live in a country, somebody else lives in a country. It's much more focused on that sort of structure. Where they argue, on the other hand, that because of globalization, we're seeing this new form of socio-political, economic, cultural organization. So they're saying, again, it's a little bit of the postmodern idea that nation states, the idea of nationalism that we looked at in the previous chapter, that they're already kind of outmoded, or already sort of being replaced or supplanted by this new sort of empire idea. And there's some, ways that makes sense, where if you look at some of the largest economies of the world are, like, say, for example, Exxon Mobil, the oil company, has a lot more money than a lot of countries, for example. So how do corporations play a role there? How do some of these huge multinationals, how did all those things sort of work in our new global economy? So a couple groups I wanted you to be aware of. So there's this one here, World Social Forum. So this is a group that has struggled in recent years. They were bigger sort of in the early 2000s, where they were opposed to those sort of major international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, some of those groups. So one of their primary, this again, World Social Forum, you can see shares some of the same words as this World Economic Forum, which is still a pretty big deal. They meet every year here. So let me show you their website here, so you can see World Economic Forum, Quiet Transformation and Climate Change is on their homepage. So this is a sort of very high level group that meets every year, sort of in the snowy mountains of Switzerland. So particularly since it's in Switzerland, it's often seen as sort of the, get together of the sort of the high and the rich and famous, high and mighty kind of folks. President Clinton has attended that quite a number of times. So there's some of the leaders of the big global banks, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, for example, would go there. So a lot of the anti-globalization folks sort of look at this as the sort of rich one percenters getting together to sort of talk about how to oppress the rest of us. So, again, it depends on your sort of perspective whether this group is good or not. So you can see the kind of issues that they would focus on here. Again, they're trying to do some good things related to employment, environment, future of government, gender parity, all these type of things. All right, switching gears a little bit here, with the idea of globalization, the movement of people often plays a key role here. So we'll look at immigrants. We want to make a little bit of a distinction between political and economic immigrants. So political immigrants often we use as interchangeably with refugees, right? So think about somebody fleeing for their lives, right? Where you're not just like, I think I could do a little bit better in this other country. There's more of like a kind of a immediacy to it. Like I better get out of here now, or things are going to get really bad. So refugee, you can see here, is someone. There's this convention that's existed for over 60 years now. So there's this idea that fear of being persecuted. So it can include a whole lot of different stuff: race, religion, nationality, some kind of political opinion, right? Like if you live in a communist country and you feel like if you speak out against the communist government, you might get killed or thrown in jail or something, right? Then you could be considered a refugee. So there's an important group that I wanted you to be aware of related to refugees in the world, right? And we call this the UNHCR, right? The UN High Commissioner for Refugees. High Commission for Refugees. So you can see, again, they're doing a lot of things with the sort of refugee population in the world. How can they sort of help out, with providing food and shelter, water, medicine, all these type of things. So I encourage you to check out the UNHCR.org website. All right, so that's political immigrants or refugees. So then we have on the other end, or on sort of the other way of looking at it, is more economic immigrants. Again, that's more we think about a lot as those hoping to improve their economic situation. Perhaps there's better wages in one country versus in the destination country versus where they come from. So this is more what we're used to, say, for the majority of immigrants in the United States. So particularly those millions of folks coming from Mexico and other points south. So the idea is that in this country, though, and most other developed countries, that they actually immigrants fill niches or sort of openings at both the high end and the low end of the labor market. So in our country, for example, the low skill tends to be much more, again, Spanish speaking, Mexico, from other Central American countries. So again, we're thinking more like landscaping, construction, those type of jobs. But then we also have immigrants that fill niches at the high end. Thinking about computer software developers, other sort of high tech, high skill jobs, and increasingly those come from places like China, India, Ghana, other African countries, for example. So again, it kind of depends on who you're talking about as far as immigrants, but the high skilled are obviously much more welcome, right? They're going to not be seen in perhaps the same light as